It was a lot of false starts before Robinhood. Like we started a company, didn't go so well, started another company, didn't go so well.
What do you think your superpower was in the early days?
We were extraordinarily driven. And I remember very much having the feeling, especially as we got to working on Robinhood, seeing people that had figured out how to build consumer products, that had figured out that product market fit, and being like, I want to do that. I want to figure out what the human condition or how these sort of technology things fit into people's lives.
Where did the idea for Robinhood come from?
Coming to America, especially as a poor immigrant kid, this was the land of opportunity. The system was all rigged against the ordinary person. The thing that sort of clicked for us at some point, if we can make it easier for people to get access to the stock market, isn't that kind of a microcosm of this whole Occupy thing that's happening? If you give people the tools to pursue their own self-betterment, the rate of change of things is going to surprise you. All the while of building Robinhood, I was quite interested in space. Watching the reusable rockets land, I kind of had this idea in my head. I'm like, man, I think if commercial space is ever going to be a thing, this is something that I want. And if it's happening in my lifetime, this is something I want to be a part of.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Minus One podcast, where we interview the world's most interesting people about the times in their life when they had to figure out what to do next. I'm your host, Aditya Agarwal, a partner at South Park Commons, and I'm joined today by a dear friend, an incredible human being, Baiju, who I think had had an amazing track record that we will get into. Baiju, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. Well, Baiju, I still remember meeting you. I want to say circa 2011 or 12, maybe 13.
Was it that early?
I think I remember that we used to have the infamous happy hours at Dropbox on Friday evenings, and I think you had a bunch of folks that you knew in common. And I still remember today that kind of being struck by your charisma. Like you definitely had a magnetism to you. Kind of in the sea of I think people that often got invited to those, and it was kind of used to be a rollicking good time. I still remember that you had a magnetism to you.
It was a rollicking good time.
It's maybe too much fun, too much fun. Kind of the glory years of Silicon Valley, circa 2013 and 14. But Baiju, tell us about some of your early history, kind of like in your life, because I think your provenance story is somewhat remarkable and somewhat rare, even for kind of, I would say, Silicon Valley. So tell us a little bit more about your early days. What roads did you follow that led you to San Francisco?
It's kind of interesting. The story is actually quite relevant for the companies that I've started and the path that I've taken. It actually starts with my dad. So our family moved to the U.S. from India, and my dad at the time had this dream of pursuing a degree in physics in America. So he was like the one kid in his town that like applied to PhD programs every year in, year out. And after like many years of applying, he finally gets in. I think he had kind of decided that he wanted to really devote his life to science. He was like, I'm not sure I want to have kids. I'm not sure I want to get married. I want to spend my life studying physics. And I think all these things kind of happen in rapid succession. He gets into University of Huntsville, Alabama. He marries my mom, and my mom is pregnant with me. And so that's kind of where my journey in life and being born in America started.
But your dad was born in India.
Dad was born in India. And when my mom got on the plane, she was pregnant with me. We learned English together, which is Gujarati was my first language, actually. Grew up at the University of Huntsville, Alabama. And afterwards, my dad actually had some health problems along the way and had to stop out of his PhD program, gets a job at NASA. And so I grew up with him studying physics before that, and then being a research scientist at NASA. And have you ever been to Langley Air Force Base?
I have not had the pleasure and privilege.
Yeah, it's like in Southern Virginia. I remember every it's like Friday or Saturday night, there was a NASCAR ring there, and you would hear the NASCAR engines going around. But I grew up with these like giant wind tunnels, and my dad being I think he was an atmospheric scientist at the time at NASA, and with physics as his backdrop. As the years go by, when I was a little bit older, I decided that I really wanted to study physics and math. And my dad was sort of like, it's like when I was growing up, Like my dad is my grandfather wanted to be, wanted me to be a doctor, but I always wanted to study physics. So I'm not gonna tell you what you should pursue in life. And I think it really like if somebody tells you that you shouldn't think about doing something, it's gonna like you're obviously gonna do that. And he was a great physics teacher and a great math teacher to me. So I learned a lot of like I remember I took a class on pre-algebra with him and really fell in love with the subject matter material.
One thing, have you ever seen the show For All Mankind?
I've not, no.
It's on Apple TV. It's kind of about, it's an alternative retelling of the space race. Like, what if the space race never ended? And like the USA and Soviet Union was still going at it. And, we kind of then ended up having human colonies on the moon and Mars. And it's really well done. But the reason I bring this up is because now that you say this, one of the lead characters, her name is Margot. She's from Huntsville, Alabama. And she ends up leading NASA in this new universe that they have created. And I've always like, why would she be from Huntsville, Alabama? But now it makes sense. I didn't realize that they had a huge presence of like scientists there. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm actually very curious to go back. I haven't been back since I was a kid. But there's actually a big aerospace community there today. At least that's what my understanding is. So it'd be cool to do that. It'd also be cool to do some stuff in Virginia again at some point too, because as you know, we're both Californians. Virginia's always really felt like home to me too.
That's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, so went on to study physics and math at Stanford, and kind of to this point, right? I remember growing up and seeing the aerospace industry kind of up close and personal. And when I got to study physics and math at Stanford, and it was like much more on the theoretical side, I kind of looking back on it, there wasn't really an option to work on space stuff then,
Hmm.
right? I think if there was, it probably would have captured my interest.
So you grew up, but kind of, if I may pause for a second, it is rare for people from Alabama to go to Stanford. Like, that is not a common thing.
Virginia, if for a large, yeah.
How did you like, were you just really good at school? Like, were you very good, gifted academically? Like, I'm curious, like that's again something, you look back on and you're like, wow, that you don't see that every day.
Yeah, it's actually kind of an interesting journey. When I got to high school, I really turned it on. When I was before that, I remember I was not a particularly good student. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that English was my second language. Like I learned English like when I was, I want to say like 4 or 5 years old, like preschool time is when I was learning English. And the other catalyst, and this is actually something that I don't think I've talked too much about this publicly, but my dad, like I said, had a lot of health problems when I was a kid. So his kidneys failed when I was pretty young. Um, and just a little bit of personal backdrop, right? I was an only child. Like we had one income. My dad was a scientist. My mom never really worked. She never had a job. We would do some little sort of business things on the side, but we were not very well off as a kid. And when I was in eighth grade, that was a little personal. My dad, his kidney disease kind of took a turn for the worse, and he was hospitalized for kind of a while. And that was like looking back on the person that I've become. Like that was the point at which I went from I became like a full on man at a pretty young age. By the way, my dad's healthy. He's fine. I actually saw him a couple of weeks ago. Um, but I think it was that like there's nothing like having feeling like your back is against the wall to bring out that sort of like you know focus intensity.
Kind of just like that gumption, that courage. By the way, thank you for sharing that. I don't think we have talked about this before, but um, my mom got on a plane with me because my dad had was kind of working in Cameroon in Central Africa, and he had left when my mom was pregnant because he got a job there. So my mom, this is like in 1982. I am literally like 8 weeks old, right? She gets on a plane, first time getting on a plane, right? To go travel from India to Cameroon in Africa by herself. Um, and she takes me there to go visit, like to basically be like, yeah, I want to live with, my husband, and like, he should see his son. And I think that sometimes I think to the situations that I'm in and, where courage is required of me. And I'm just like, wow, think about the crazy things that our parents had to do to get us to this point. And in some ways, what the world asks of us is actually much much smaller, like I think, than what it asked of them. And it took me a long time, I think, to understand it, to have a deep appreciation for it, but then also just kind of be like, my God, they're rock stars. Like I don't know if I would take my 8 week old on a trip for the first time on a plane to Central Africa. Even today, I'm like, that's insane to me, right? So I'm very proud of my parents. It took me, for doing the stuff that they did in my early days.
Man, I couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. Like I actually didn't know that about you. But yeah, our parents had huge courage. I mean, it's actually such a similar story, right? My dad got into to study physics. He was going to go by himself. My mom was, I think, going to try to stay back in India. She was very close to her family there. And the story she says is she went to the embassy and they're like, "Oh, you're pregnant. Like, let's stamp your card. You're going to go to America." You think about that, right? Is like there was no internet there. Like I remember my parents could barely afford to make phone calls back home to India. Um, and you imagine the sort of understanding of the world that people had then, like a foreign country felt like a different planet, I'm sure, right? And to just say, you know what, I'm going to leave this whole life behind and go somewhere where it's a totally different culture, where like you just don't.
It's kind of like going to space today. I think that when the first people will go to Mars, or maybe onto human colonies, or kind of like essentially like floating near Earth, kind of orbital, kind of like essentially habitats, it will feel like that's what it must have been like for them.
The culture shock, I think, of coming to America must have been pretty intense for my parents too, reflecting back on it. Um, Anyways, so that's kind of the backdrop of where I grew up, right? And so story after that goes to I met my co-founder of Robinhood in college. We were roommates for a year. And we took a lot of the same classes together. We were like best of homies. Um, and I was a little bit older. I had the harebrained idea of starting a company after having a job for a little while. And I convinced him to want to do it with me. Um, and it was a lot of false starts before Robinhood. Like we started a company, didn't go so well, started another company, didn't go so well. And at the time I think this was probably around the time that I met you. And it's like, 2011, 12, 13, 14. We had the idea for Robinhood in 2012, if I remember correctly. A bit of an aside, I remember where the first time I met you, I was quite taken. I was like, man, this is an extremely charismatic leader. And I think
I appreciate you saying that.
you very much left that impression on me too. Because I'd heard about you before, right? And I think I had kind of I'd asked for a couple of invites to Dropbox because I was like, I want to meet some of these people that are doing this stuff. And yeah, just it like the seeing you running Dropbox and a lot of the engineering functions, then it was like, man, this is what the sort of like persona it takes to get a huge group of people corralled to doing time cloud storage.
But first of all, thank you for saying that. I'm not a person who takes compliments, I think, easily. So I will bask in the adulation for like 3 seconds, and thank you.
I remember also the first time we had dinner together. I want to say that was a little bit later. That was like 2017 or maybe 2018. I remember a super dimly lit place that we went to dinner.
Well, now my visual memory is playing tricks on me, because I remember the dinner. I don't remember where we went. Um, Good times. But here's a question. I mean, listen, every Stanford kid wants to start a company. That's kind of, a thing. But it takes so much persistence in the early days. So how, like, were you just, young and not impressionable, like young and driven, did not know what you don't know. So you keep on running against walls? Because you and Vlad are both remarkable. What would you say was in retrospect, what do you think your superpower was in the early days? Was it in some ways that naive optimism that like, hey, what else are we going to do? We just got like, this is it, right? But I'm curious now that you look back on, like, what would you say your superpower was in those early days?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, we were extraordinarily driven. Like we were extraordinarily driven. And I think that's a combination of kind of you don't know what you don't know. And I remember very much having the feeling, especially as we got to the working on Robinhood, seeing people that had figured out how to build consumer products, right? Like seeing people that had figured out that product market fit and being like, I want to do that. Like, I want to figure out what those insights are about like the human condition or how these sort of technology things fit into people's lives. Because if you kind of get it, then you end up building something that's like ubiquitous immediately, right? So very driven, I would say. Another thing that I would attribute a decent bit of it to was that there was a really powerful dynamic duo, right? Like there was one of the things that I remember about that is like when one of us would be kind of, you've seen this before, right? Like if you're going at it year in, year out, you have periods where you're kind of burned out, right? Where the creativity is not really there, the energy level is not there, the optimism is kind of fading because of whatever thing happened. And I kind of always found that when one of us was a little bit on the downswing, the other one sort of was like roaring to go. Um, and yeah, I think that especially at that early age, having that sort of like, we were co-creators, co-CEOs, like we were like in it together. And the reason I say that is I think the sort of idea of having a co-founder as a company, especially if you're doing it the first time around, is
Yeah.
pretty important, I think.
Yeah, I look back and I'm just like, I've seen that dynamic play out, especially if you're doing the company the first time, where you kind of, in some ways, are learning about your own emotional state. I think at the second time founder, it's a bunch easier because you are hopefully not walking into it with like, and you're kind of actually able to understand that emotional stability while riding the highs is kind of like what being a founder is about. But if you're doing it for the first time, my God, the roller coaster is intense, right? And having somebody to even you out, I think is critical. And Ruchi and I play that role for each other. I am naturally kind of like often, I would say prone to higher highs and lower lows because that's my personality. And Ruchi is just a lot more even, and I think she helps to even out both the highs and the lows, and that plays a huge part, I think, in our working relationship.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of parallels between that and our relationship when we were starting it.
If you can, if you remember, like, what was, like, where did the idea for Robinhood come from? I'm sure you've had to answer this question a bunch, right? I don't think that I'm the first person asking this question, but maybe tell us, like, what was the initial, like, the spark that kind of gave you guys that?
Yeah, it happened over a phone conversation. I think I was in New York. Vlad was in San Francisco. We had been working on a previous company before this. And at the time, the backdrop was this Occupy Wall Street stuff. And I remember we kind of were on the periphery of it. We kind of see it, and people would ask us about it, but we weren't like camping out in it or anything. Like I remember the backdrop of it though was something that left like quite an impression on me. And what am I talking about here? This kind of comes back to like my background. I think you'll probably be able to see a lot of this in yourself too, right? But coming to America, especially as a poor immigrant kid, right? This was the land of opportunities. Like this was the place where people all around the world wanted to come because this was the place where you could create your own sort of outcomes, right? And I remember this in school too, right? As like, man, I was like, education is super important because this is like one of the lessons in life, right? Is like education is your way out. At the same time, the backdrop, and I felt this was especially true for people whose families had been in America for a long time, right? Like there was this like, this sense that like the system was fucked up. Like it was all like rigged against the ordinary person and that people kind of, there's like the sense of like wanting to tear the whole thing down, right? That's literally what people are protesting. And I remember at the time being like, what is happening here? Like, because we're just like, this is it like I couldn't rationalize that in my brain because I'm like, yo, this is the land of opportunity, right? And like I think that the thing that sort of clicked for us at some point in that first conversation was like, hey, wait a second. If we can make it easier for people to get access to the stock market, like isn't that kind of a microcosm of this whole Occupy thing that's happening? And in particular, if you look at like the two possibilities, right? You tear the thing down, or you get a bunch more people to be a part of the financial system so that then they're like rooting for the positive outcomes for the whole society. Like that's another answer, right?
I mean, I actually think that, like, in some ways, like the American, at least America's foreign policy, if you will, right, for like, post kind of World War II was like, hey, if people believe in the global, essentially like liberal democracy and capitalist system, then everyone gets along, right? And I think that if you kind of think about your core thesis there, it's the same thing but applied domestically, at least to start, right? Which is that like the system is not perfect. The system had a bunch of like, jagged edges that don't work, and we try to smooth those out, but it is still the best fucking system we know, right? Like all alternative systems, whether of like organizing your economy or of your politics, are worse, you know. So until we can figure something else out, I think it's better to try to like make this system work.
I would say the experience of building Robinhood has made me really appreciate the power of capitalism. And I think this is actually connecting the dots to what I'm doing right now. Was like one of the core theses, right? Because this was the thing about Robinhood that we basically built a product that gave access to the capital markets and we put it in everybody's pocket. And the thing that was like, there's a lot of really interesting shit about it, but like one of the things that really stood out was if you give people the tools to pursue their own self betterment, the rate of change of things is going to it's going to surprise you. You know, like things change is going to happen so much faster. Um, and you think about the world when we were starting Robinhood versus today, right? One of this is like my personal benchmark for this, right? Is being on top of your money or like being like, I'm not going to waste my money, but I'm going to think about how I can like save or create for myself, right? That was not cool. Like 10, 15 years ago, right? Like being kind of clueless about your money was like, I don't know, like oftentimes in society, especially amongst young people, is kind of like a badge of honor. And I was like, doesn't make any damn sense to me, right?
It's so dumb. But now you're right. Actually, if you think about it, it's kind of it's cooler to actually know to be smart about those things, right? And that is so much better than kind of like it's not a flex to be like essentially like a dumb investor. No, it's up like it's no flex.
I believe this is what the younger folks would call vibe shift. All
It's like you got the riz, bro. Oh man.
right, so I'm going to tie this to space, okay?
Actually, sorry. Before you go into that, I do want to. I don't. I don't think I've told you this, but one of my heroes is Milton Friedman, right? And he's obviously like a hardcore libertarian capitalist. But the book that has probably affected me most is Capitalism is Freedom. I do not think that those two things can be separated because ultimately, like by being able to control what you do with your money and your time is the best expression of your ability to kind of shape your life in the way you want to, right? And I think that by having a political system that allows you to express that is the biggest form of freedom that we can have. And I fundamentally believe that all human beings are very smart. They actually make amazing self-interested decisions that leads to both better for them and for the global system, right? And I think anybody who has a alternative view of the world is actually being highly paternalistic, right? About people who might frankly have lower capital than them. I'm like, no, I actually think everybody's super smart about this, right? And it's the greatest form of respect that you can give to everyone, that you can make the best decisions about your own life. Anyways, bring us to space.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it well. So let's connect the dots to space here. So all the while of building Robinhood, I was quite interested in space. Like I grew up around it. I was really enamored by the idea of like what was going to happen if the space race actually happened, right? This was kind of the thing that growing up around all these like artifacts of NASA and stuff, going to Stanford to study physics, and then just kind of like the most interesting thing was getting a job at like some aerospace company. It it felt like the space race had been won and like everybody lost, right?
That's well put. That's really well put. Yeah, exactly.
Like it happened and it just kind of, it felt like society just got distracted by the internet.
Yeah, it's like who's going to space today? No one. Who has benefited from like anything related to space in the last 10 years? No one, except for now, I guess Starlink. Like that's kind of a very direct consumer benefit. But you're totally right. Is yeah,
So watching the reusable rockets land, I kind of had this idea in my head. I'm like, man, I think if commercial space is ever going to be a thing, this is something that I want. And if it's happening in my lifetime, this is something I want to be a part of, right? And the thought there was actually not altogether unrelated from Robinhood. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Is like when I look at the space industry, the thing that stands out to me the most, and this is outside, like this is pre SpaceX, is it's for the government, by the government, at government prices, right? And every mission, like if you kind of peel the onion layer back a little bit, it's nation states that are doing this, right? And that I think is a huge problem because what that basically means is it's not an industry that's spinning with the flywheel of capitalism, right? And I just think that the flywheel of capitalism is the point I was making a few moments ago, right? It accelerates progress. And so the thought process was, if you look at, and this is kind of like my sort of rude approximation of like what the space industry is, right? If you think of low Earth orbit as a platform, right? A platform for global distribution, which is kind of how I think about it. I will make the argument not altogether different from something like an app store, which is a platform for distribution, right? Because when you're in low Earth orbit, think about Starlink, right? You're not over one place. You're kind of, if you want to be useful in one place, you kind of by default are going to be useful in most places. And that's because satellites move around really quickly. Um, if you look at, if you think space then is low Earth orbit is a platform, right? You ask the question, what verticals of the economy exist on this platform? And I make the argument that there's less than there should be, right? The broad buckets as I see it are like Earth imaging slash academia, defense, and telecommunications. So if you want to work in space and you want to do it commercially, like these are some of the broad buckets of commercial activity that are happening there. There's no way that that's the full spectrum of what's going to happen in space. And the thought process was if you could stand up a new vertical of the economy in space, that's going to be one of these things that's like this massive accelerant for everything as small as when people graduate from school being like, you know what, I want to go get an aerospace degree because there's good jobs that are going to create a lot of value that are space related, all the way to the point of like, I think space becomes a more intrinsic part of the human experience, which I think you fast forward the clock 500 years, like humans are going to be a species that occupies our solar system, I believe. Space has got to be real for people.
It's got to be real for people. It's also interesting, right? Like there are these you can call it like civilization level beliefs or almost like technologies. Like capitalism is one of them, right? Like, representational democracy is one of them, right? Which is that we have these technologies that apply at the civilization level that allow all of us to do something collectively, but then also to believe together collectively, right? And I think that if you're able to essentially do the same for space, you are able, like, if you're able to, for instance, provide this platform, I think it's kind of amazing to allow civilization as a whole to dream together collectively. And if you tie it back to capitalism and kind of to the individual, I have a lot of faith in humans to actually build incredible things if they're given these platforms, right? And I think we are vastly more, in some ways, creative and driven than the manifestation today in like the companies and startups. Like I think there's a tremendous amount of upside as long as you kind of give people some of these core capabilities. So I think if we're able to do that for space, I think how wild would that be if it happens in our lifetime?
Yeah, I'm working my butt off to make that happen. And my part of it.
Tell us a little bit more about Aetherflux.
Aetherflux start out with the mission of the company, which is to deliver energy to planet Earth. So we're building an energy company in space. So what does this mean, right? Kind of coming back to the low Earth orbit as a platform. Um, I believe that one of the verticals that is going to exist, that we're working to make happen, is energy in space. And I think that there's a couple of reasons that's pretty interesting, but I'll get into kind of what. Actually, let's start out with the simplest explanation of what we're doing. We're building a constellation of satellites, each one that collects power and transmits it down to the ground. And on the ground, there's receiver stations that collect the power. And the concept is, in the same way that there's a lot of satellites that you need to service a single point on the ground for Starlink, right? There will be a large proliferated constellation of these satellites, each one that performs this function. The reason I say that constellation and kind of making a point on this is, and I won't get into too much of this, but the historical idea behind space solar power, because this is not a new idea, it's actually an idea from the 70s, was to have, one monolithic object that collects power and beams it down to a point. I think that's one of the things where we're exploring, like, can we make the Starlink model work for this? Because for a bunch of different reasons. But so let's ask the question, like, what's happening here, right? It's actually pretty straightforward. There's three broad buckets. First one is power generation. So you have solar panels, photovoltaics, and there's everything from Home Depot solar panels all the way, which are kind of like the cheapo solar panels, all the way to 3.5 solar panels that have higher efficiency or way more expensive. You have those as big deployable solar arrays on your satellite on each one. They're gimbaling, so they're facing the sun. They're collecting power, and they take the incident sunlight and they turn it into an electrical current. Right? So you go from photons to electrons. Now, you either have a battery in there, or sometimes you'll directly direct the power to the power transmission system. But for this argument, let's say you're basically charging up a battery on the satellite. So that's the power generation side. The second part is the power transmission. So the way that we transmit power is actually using light, and it's using infrared lasers to actually project the light down to the ground. And the idea is you use infrared lasers because they allow for a small, tight spot size. And on the ground, it in turn allows for compact receivers for power. So the way it works is, on the satellite, there is a pointing mechanism that starts out by looking for where it thinks the ground station is. So it sends out it's in searching mode. Once it finds the ground station and it forms a link with the ground station, it switches to power transmission mode. And in low Earth orbit, as it's passing overhead, it'll basically transmit power as it's passing overhead. And once it starts moving out of the field of view of the ground station, starts looking for a new ground station. What's happening here, right, is you have fiber lasers that are actually converting the electrical current that's stored in the battery and turning it into photons again. So we've gone from photons to electrons back to photons. So on the ground, you have a receiver, which we contemplate is going to be in the 5 to 10 meter diameter spot size. Maybe a little bigger at first, but as we get to bigger satellites, we think we can make it tighter. That then takes that beam of power and it has photovoltaics on it that are actually tuned for the frequency of light that you're transmitting. The reason that's important is you can get much higher efficiencies if you're tuned for one frequency of light as opposed to full spectrum. And so you have the solar array that's collecting power, and it's potentially charging a battery on the ground, which you can then use for current. And the whole idea here is that you have these small, relatively small, ideally portable receivers that you can use to generate power places where there's no infrastructure.
You can go off the grid basically because you have the constellation of satellites. It's kind of like Starlink at any given point in time. Yeah, I mean, that's a great analogy.
That's kind of the low Earth orbit, persistent overhead everywhere in the world concept that we're trying to make happen. And so what are we going to use this for, right? The idea is that first, there's places that it's really difficult to get power. So there's commercial versions of it. There's also DoD versions of it. I'll talk about the defense related applications, which one really good example is like power into the battlefield, right? Forward deployed bases, small groups of troops that are, in the battlefield doing stuff. This is a way of getting power that doesn't require transporting diesel fuel, right? Because that's kind of the lifeline of generating power for the Department of Defense. And it's expensive, it's dangerous. Um, those supply chain routes of getting power into contested regions, those are primary targets for adversaries, right? It kind of traditional, kind of has been for a long time, where our approach basically says the power generation is like a decentralized constellation in low Earth orbit. There's you think about like disabling one of the satellites, there's like one right behind it. It's.
What is the overall like capacity? Like this kind of, I'm not good with this particular spectrum of math, if you will, but like, if you had like 20,000 satellites in orbit, like whatever the Starlink number is, like how much power um, could you transmit? I guess, like, what's a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I think the power scaling is actually one of the central things that we're working on, right? So first mission, and basically the basic math of it is you get more power in space as you're able to transport more mass to orbit, right? So the ability to get to like, we're going to start out with our first mission. We have two missions that we're planning for next year. Those are going to be at the kilowatt power level output of the satellite. So, we kind of set that as a benchmark of, we're like, that's kind of where we call this, power transmission. Um, and, this kind of our internal sort of line in the sand. And the idea is there's a bunch of technology that goes into scaling lasers. They exist at that power level on the ground today. Like making those work in space is kind of the challenge we're biting off first. Then, as you want to get to more power, you get to it by having higher power lasers and having bigger deployable solar arrays that generate more power. So it's sort of like, you know, as we get closer to that point, you're going to be able to ask the question like, how much power can you increment in orbit with each Starship launch, for example, right?
And it's actually non-linear. I mean, like, I guess that the whole point is that it scales. I could imagine coverage and raw power, I guess, scales non-linearly, well, super linearly with the amount of like stuff you have up there, which is nice.
The thing that really bends the curve, I think, is Starship, right? Because then you can start talking about getting what I think the number is like 100 metric tons, if I'm not mistaken, into orbit per launch. Like that's a huge amount, right? Like this is like one of the um and they're whatever the number is today, they're already talking about future starships, right? That potentially could be even bigger. But like kind of the unlock here, right, is like if you think about getting to low Earth orbit as like a mode of transportation, right? We don't think about it like that right now, right? Nobody asks the question like how much mass can you, move from Asia to North America? It's like, well, you just have more boats and more planes and you like do more trips, right? When Starship becomes fully reusable in that way, I think you start thinking about, well, it's like, well, we're gonna, you know, ship these solar panels from China to the United States on a boat. Like we could as well ship them to low Earth orbit, right, on a rocket. Um, and I think the timing of what we're trying to do here is as that capability comes online, which, you know, 2 years, 5 years remains to be seen, maybe sooner, maybe a little bit longer. We want to be ready to actually scale manufacturing to be able to say, hey, we're ready to go in the early days of it and have the manufacturing capacity to build enough satellites to fill a whole Starship, right? Because I do think that the amount of launch that they're going to be developing for the Mars mission is going to be tremendous, right?
I think Elon said he wants to do what, like 2 or 3 launches a day for 2 years straight or something like that. Yeah, I know. If that works, I mean, that it's just so crazy to kind of envision that kind of capacity. Um, Actually, we have time for probably one more question. So maybe what I'd ask you is, it takes a tremendous amount both of like vision and foresight, but I think also of patience to build in the space that you are building. So how do you kind of like keep in some ways the momentum and the energy up in like a longer in what is absolutely a long arc mission like you have at Aetherflux? And is that but or are you is that somewhat easy to do just because it's such a cool thing to work on?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting question. A lot of it at this point is muscle memory, right? The actual company building. Um, and by that, I like building companies. Like I enjoy doing it, right? It's like fun, it's fun to me. Like working with like a small group of people on something where you don't know what the outcome is going to be, right? You're like you got a lot of problems to figure out, but like you haven't worked through all of them yet. Like that's kind of what I want to be spending my waking hours as a human being doing, you know? And I look at the stage of life that I'm at, and I hope I have the same level of sort of fire and gumption to do this when I'm a decade older. But I want to capture these good years while I still have the energy in me to do it. Um, I think there's another part of this too, right? Is like doing this the first time, the outcome was a really big deal, right? It's like, well, we want to build something that's successful. This time around, I really want to enjoy the journey too, right? Because I look back at the journey of Robinhood and I'm like, yeah, the success was fun, but and I'm sure you feel this way too, right? Like the memories that are really burned in your mind are when you're like when you didn't know and you figured it out and you turned out that that was the right thing, and just the feeling that you get when you're at the forefront of an industry, right?
I mean, I really love the way you put it, which is that, I've answered this question explicitly, which is like, what do I want to do with my life? And, in some ways have the luxury of asking that question. And a lot of it just comes down to I want to work on hard, interesting problems with a very talented team in a no bullshit environment where we are kind of limited by like our own desires and abilities as opposed to kind of bureaucracy and politics, right? And for me, that's taken the form of like, working at South Park Commons and growing kind of our mission there. But if not, it would, and also I've started, a couple of companies recently, and it's all comes down to the same thing, which is that I love starting things. I just love working on hard problems with like driven people with in kind of like ambiguous situations. But in one, there's like, everyone's kind of rowing on the same boat pretty hard. So it's a I think that gives a ton of satisfaction to me. So it sounds like it's the same for you.
Yeah. The difficulty and the scale of the problem, um, early on, that feels really daunting. As you get further along, I feel like pays dividends in terms of satisfaction, right? Because you're like, check out what we did.
Check out what we did. We figured it out. We didn't get psyched out. Anyways, Baiju, thank you so much for taking the time. Yeah, I think I think these stories of like founders and kind of what they had to do in the early days when they kind of tackle these daunting problems is just really inspiring for us at South Park Commons as we figure out like how do we push founders to tackle the bigger kind of problems, right? Like let's not just go build like the fifth version of something that already exists. Let's go tackle the big problems. And I think hearing from you is just kind of inspiring. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
That was another episode of Minus One from the team at South Park Commons. Make sure to subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts and find us on social at South Park Commons. And thanks to our friends at Atomic Growth for their support in bringing this episode to life.